My name is Geoff Dyer, and I've got the great pleasure and privilege of speaking to Ben Fountain about his new, absolutely wonderful book, Billy Lin's Long Half-Time Walk, which is just coming out now from Canongate. And that'll be followed next year by his incredible book of short stories, Brief Encounters with Che Guevara, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But first we're going to concentrate on the novel. It's always great to meet the authors of books that one really admires, and there have been few novels in the last 5 years that I've admired quite as much as yours. But also, it's not just a question of admiring. I mean, it was just such a pleasure to read the book. It's so enjoyable. And I wonder if you could, just for my own personal curiosity, really, if you could take me back to the very first sort of sense of, you know, how the idea came to you of setting this book in such a condensed period of time.
Part of it is me trying to keep it simple. I've had a couple of failed novels, and I think my downfall in those was they were too complex, too many characters, too much time involved. And so it takes, this novel, Billy Lin, takes place over the course of one day. And in a sense, it's me trying not to screw up, trying to keep it simple, you know, just to be frank. But I also, I mean, I found it very appealing, this idea of hitting it hard, hitting it fast, getting in and out. And I felt like, you know, as I was thinking about the book, that I could do pretty much what I wanted to do, and maybe even do it better by concentrating it all in one day. And, you know, to, you know, mimic the sensory overload that the soldiers themselves experienced. So just hit the reader full on, and then we're done.
Yeah, and I guess there's a sort of mini tradition of books that take place in one day. I guess the most famous example would be Ulysses. We've got Ian McEwan's Saturday, and then we've got Nicholson Baker doing you know, the whole book set in a lunch hour.
Yeah.
But I guess what's quite interesting in your book, I mean, it takes place in, you know, however many hours, and entirely, I mean, there's accounts of stuff happening outside, but also in one place, in the Cowboys Stadium. So it's a temporal and spatial compression.
Right. I felt like it would be interesting and hopefully illuminating to, yes, put them in Texas Stadium, and for all practical purposes, I mean, there is the lead-in where they're in the limo on their way to the stadium. But otherwise, except for that one flashback where Billy is portrayed as going home for two nights and one day, it's all in the stadium. But I felt like, well, the stadium is kind of a city. And so you have the Bravos, Billy and his comrades, moving vertically through American society. And they're even below ground at one point, at several points, and they make their way all the way up to the owner's suite at the top, and then all the stations in between. And so I felt like Texas Stadium was big enough and expansive enough and contained enough that it wouldn't be constricting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly not. It's a vision of America, isn't it? Completely in there, and it's quite. This structural thing you do, it's quite interesting. So the book is called Billy Lin's Long Half-Time Walk, and then in part of the way through the book we get this kind of intermission where we get the flashback to his weird visit home. Was that always going to be there, or was that something that came to you, you know, sort of midway through?
I was really struggling with the book. The first 40 pages, I rewrote a number of times, and I was trying to get the sound of the book and trying to figure out who the soldiers were, and Billy in particular. And it wasn't, and I was trying to figure out, okay, how do I slide in backstory? Because we've really got to care about these guys to stick with the story. And I was trying to slip in Billy's story in bits and pieces. And then one day I thought, I'll just devote a whole section to him going home. And so tell a smaller story within the larger novel, and have that interlude at home, you know, if not be a completely standalone piece, more or less. And once I decided to do that and it felt right, then the whole book in perspective, you know, prospectively seemed to fall into place. I could start to see the whole thing. But so it wasn't part of the initial conception of the book, but I hit on it fairly early in the reading, and it was, I was thinking I would balance it out at some point with another flashback, maybe to Iraq itself. But in the end, I thought I can do without the symmetry, and we're just going to leave that one flashback intact, and the rest of the book is in the now time of that day at Texas Stadium.
Yeah, just for people who haven't read the book, just tell us a little, if you could describe that interlude back home, because a lot goes on in that brief visit.
Right. Well, the Bravos are in the United States for 2 weeks. They're on their so-called victory tour, where the administration is taking them around to different cities across America to pump up support for the war. But the soldiers of Bravo Squad get 2 nights and 1 full day at their homes, their respective homes. And so Billy's hometown is a place called Stovall, Texas. And it's about 70 miles west of Dallas. So he goes home, and he has a, you know, your basic functioning, dysfunctional American family with a father who's a disabled father in a wheelchair from a double stroke. He was a former DJ. His mother is an office manager at an oil field services company. He's got 1 older sister who's married with a young son who's there for the visit. And then Billy's other sister, Catherine, who was the star of the family until she had this car wreck where she's disfigured, although they're in the process of repairing that. And she's living at home these days while she recovers. So Billy walks into the middle of this, you know, a vortex of family.
Yeah, and it's very intense, and it's incredibly funny. I mean, the father is this sort of awful figure, but absolutely hilarious as well. What about the figure of Billy then? How did you arrive at him as the sort of point of view character?
You know, so many of these things get worked out along the way, and you aren't sure how it's going to work until you put pen to paper and start going. And but pretty quickly I settled on Billy. It would be close third person, and it would be present tense. And part of the challenge of Billy was he's 19 years old. He's got a high school education from the Texas public schools, never been to college, and has never been much of a reader until he entered the Army and came under the mentorship of Sergeant Bream. But so the challenge was, well, it's told from the point of view of Billy, but I don't want to restrict myself to pure stream of consciousness from a 19-year-old American kid's point of view. And so the rationale I hit on for the way I approached it was, all right, Billy's a smart kid, and he is very much alert and alive to what's going on around him. And beyond that, he's trying to figure out why things are the way they are. It's become, in one sense, a matter of life and death for him. And so I felt like if you could stop at any one point in the action and sit Billy down and say, okay, Billy, what are you feeling and what are you thinking? What I have on the page is what he would give to you. And so while he's having these thoughts and emotions and reactions in the course of the book, while they may not be at the strictly articulate level, that is what he's feeling and thinking, you know, on various levels. And so I felt like the narrative voice of the book was allowed to set it out, you know, in some detail about, you know, this is really what's going on with Billy. And if you could sit him down and he would articulate, this is what he'd say, but things are moving so fast that for him, you know, these are taking place often on the subarticulate or semi-articulate level internally.
And that works absolutely brilliantly. And now we've got to broach this subject. I don't know, have you read Laurie Moore's book, A Gate at the Stairs?
No.
Terrific book,
Yeah.
narrated allegedly by a woman in her sort of mid-20s, I guess, something like that, or late 20s, latest. It's a great book, but it never sounds for a moment really as though it's anyone other than basically Laurie Moore, a woman who's about our age actually. So yeah, our age, we're both 54. As you say, Billy is 19. So there's a bit of a generation gap there. How did you get that so right? I mean, as you say, he's 19. He sounds 19 to me.
Yeah. Well, I was 19 once. You know, like you, several centuries ago. You know, that's what writers do. I mean, we try to work ourselves into the skins of our characters, and it doesn't happen usually overnight. It's a process where you really just work your way in, dig your way in, and I've done this kind of work long enough to know that it takes time, and if it's working for you, it will happen. And you've just got to, you know, concentrate over the long haul. But I mean, a 19-year-old American male, and I started thinking about, well, what was I like when I was 19? Well, I mean, obviously, what's on every 19-year-old healthy heterosexual male's mind?
Beer.
Yeah, yeah. So you know. Obviously, that's very much on Billy's mind. Yeah.
Even when he's lying with his sister.
Right. I mean, he's oozing sexuality, but it's not as simple as that. And I don't think. I mean, even for the most callow 19-year-old, I think often, in addition to that, you know, this desire for sex and to party, you know, booze, drugs, whatever, there's this parallel life going on and a very genuine and sometimes desperate inquiry into what's going on. Yeah. Who am I? What am I doing with my life? What am I going to do with my life? What constitutes a good life? And why are things the way they are? And so I think that's one reason why being young is such hard work, because you're veering between, you know, this intense physicality on the one hand, and on the other hand, I mean, you know, no matter how articulate or inarticulate, I think what it often boils down to are these, you know, fundamental existential questions. And maybe a 19-year-old doesn't have, you know, the exact language to articulate those things, those existential questions. But that's the essence of what they're feeling.
Indeed, and in his case, and it wasn't the case for you and me, he's already had this massive experience. Right. Probably I think he actually says at one point that he feels this is the experience that he's going to actually spend the rest of his life processing, being in this, you know, in this huge firefight in Iraq. Right. We'll come back to that. Just to go back to this thing of sort of bridging the gap between, you as an author in your 50s writing about a 19-year-old. Okay, I take your point completely about these things. These things don't change. What does change, though, with extraordinary rapidity is language. I mean, particularly here in Britain, you know, now people are speaking in a completely different way to the way that was the case 30 years ago. I'm guessing it's the same in America too. So I wondered how you managed to get the language so completely. I mean, maybe I'm not the best person to judge, but it felt as up to the minute as Sam Lipsyte's book, The Ask, let's say, admittedly in a different register, of course.
I read a lot of books. I read all the magazine articles, and by the end of the writing of the book, I had, you know, stacks of magazines probably, and newspaper articles. I mean, I was trying to get my hands on anything and everything. And, you know, in a way and a big part of that was not just trying to get military, like the details in the big picture of military life right, but I felt like part of the task was to construct a language that was true to the characters and the experience. And I mean, that seemed like very much part of it. And whether the book succeeded or failed would rest to a large extent on whether I was successful in constructing that idiom.
Yeah, yeah. But it's okay, so you speak about the sort of magazines, that kind of stuff, which I guess we could file under the heading of research. And what about, though, in your normal life, though, are you sort of interacting with young people much? Are you just hearing this stuff accidentally as opposed to, you know, researching it? Right,
accidentally on purpose. I mean, you know, as writers, we always have our ears open and our eyes open, and I'm always on the lookout for, you know, turns of phrase that seem to illuminate the world, you know, put the world in a different slant, in a different light, and you know, that could be something as, you know, high-toned as reading the New Yorker and the about town, you know, blurbs on music and art, and seeing the wonderful things they do with language in just that small space, and how they can illuminate, encapsulate something in just a phrase. And listening to the radio, or just when my son's friends come over, you know, just kind of like, not strictly eavesdropping. Well, he's 25 now, but you know, just all through his high school and college years, just, you know, the wonderful language that would come out of their mouths. I mean, just so expressive and so original, and often just completely hilarious.
Yeah, yeah. And what about, do you think there's something particularly fertile, resourceful and original about that language once it gets channeled through the military machinery?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that strikes me is that there's a problem with British writing about the military. Well, it's a problem for British writing generally, which is that it's everybody is class identified almost the moment they open their mouths. And in the army, there's a very sharp division between sort of proles and toffs, really. Let's put it like that. In America, of course, people aren't class identified, but by the way they speak. I mean, not instantly like that. But the thing that comes across so powerfully is that you've got this lovely sort of racial mixture of different ways of speaking. So that great kind of, I don't want to call it a symphony, but these different voices, and with some of the characters you recognize them in the book by their voices way before you're able to physically, visually identify them.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe we could call it a democracy of language, where, and especially in the Army, where people from, you know, vastly different backgrounds, geographical background, you know, racial, economic, you know, they are thrown together, and through this, they each bring their own, you know, language to it, their own manner of speaking, and it all gets mashed together, and mixes and gets stewed around, and often something pretty wonderful comes out of it. I mean, incredibly expressive, and with its own philosophy behind it.
Yeah, 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 exactly. And it's okay. So that's, yeah, there's this sort of military thing. But if we go back to your stories, I mean, you know, that's the power and the exuberance of the language. I mean, that's there right from the start, isn't it? In your stuff.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, it's not me trying to write pretty. It's not a question of style as a matter of decoration, or trying to be striking, or, you know, showing my chops. I think that each story, you know, each project, each piece of material is going to have its own language, or needs its own language, its own idiom. And so, I mean, if we're talking about the stories, a story like Near Extinct Birds of the Central Cordillera, I kind of pull out all the stops in that because we're dealing with a very, you know, sensuous environment. I mean, it's the jungle. It's it's mountain rainforest, and we're dealing with tropical birds, and so it's a very lush environment, and I felt like that called for a very expressive idiom.
Yeah, sure.
Whereas,
yeah.
you know, other stories, you're going to see that tamped down quite a bit, and you know, the language will go in a different direction. So, you know, style is it's not so much a layering on. I mean, if it's working, it's coming from the inside out, not the other way.
Yeah, no, as somebody said, you know, it's not, yeah, it's sort of intrinsic to perception, isn't it, the style? Let's talk a little bit more about the bravos and the sort of intention of the novel. I don't know, bits of it are satirical, I think it would be fair to say. Or, I mean, I don't know, because I wrote a book where people said it was a satire on the art world, and it never seemed that way to me. And I sort of felt, God, I don't write satire. Your book does feel like it's a satire in places. How do you feel about that label?
I certainly didn't set out to write satire. I think satire is often too sure of itself. And I'm never sure of myself, or I hope I'm not, because I think once we're certain of ourselves, we stop learning, or certainly learning slows down. And I was just going for straight realism in this book, and if it feels like satire, then it's the nature of the material.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was just concentrating. I mean, I felt like I was a documentarian.
Sure, I take the point completely, and yeah, the material is so wild. I mean, that weird combination of the kind of very nearly pornographic displays that you get on in the halftime, and then the scale of the merchandising. This great sort of realization that Billy has, that at some point he sort of thinks, geez, you know, America became a mall with a country attached. And as you say, in the course of their journey through the stadium, when they go to see the equipment room, that guy, I've forgotten his name now. Yeah, takes them through that. And then one of the many great set pieces in the book, the amazing encounter of the Bravo soldiers with the football players, these incredible mammoths. Just tell us a little bit more about how that scene came to you, and for people who haven't read it, what's going on in it?
Well, Bravo gets taken down into the locker room before the game to get their footballs autographed. The owner, Norman Oglesby, has had a photo op with the soldiers, and they filmed a little commercial to be aired at halftime, and they all had footballs as props. And the Bravos felt kind of silly about that, but Norm says, come on down with me to the locker room and we'll get some ink on those footballs. And as if, you know, I mean, Norm just assumes that anyone and everyone would die for the opportunity to go down into the locker room. The Bravos are kind of like, well, yeah, sure. You know, we'll come with you. Some are more excited than others. But down in the locker room, you know, the Bravos they are warriors. I mean, they are tried and true warriors. And they are presented with the Dallas Cowboys football players who are, I mean, they're giants. They are, and if you think about the orcs in Middle Earth, you know, and especially in the wonderful movies, and there's the orcs, and then there's the super orcs, you know, they're just huge and hulking. Well, that's what these football players are. They are the super orcs, especially when they get suited up. And I've been around enough pro football players to know they are completely off the charts as far as, you know, the human scale. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And when you get 40 or 50 of them, you know, together in one room, you feel like you've wandered onto, you know, a different planet. And so, I mean, Billy's feeling when he walks in there is he feels like less of a man because of the size disparity. Yeah. And yet he's the one who's been to war. Yeah. And the football players, they are, you know, ultimately they are playing a game. And they are on a team, and they are the paid employees of Norman Oglesby and the Dallas Cowboys. And but Billy can't help himself. He feels like they are the true warriors. And at one point, he's looking around, he's thinking, oh, we should send them to fight the war. And it's not like, he doesn't think it out of spite or bitterness. He thinks no one could possibly stop them. And so send the Cowboys and the Redskins and the Eagles and the Chargers and the Giants and the Raiders and, send the whole NFL. Just suiting them up and send them straight into the war zone, and the war will be over in a few days because they can't possibly be defeated.
Especially when there's a great line when he says to his sergeant, he says, some of these guys are not right in their head. Right. No, it's tremendous, that scene. Well, and then after that, of course, though, we get the most kind of seditious or treasonous idea that comes from somebody, which is a delight to our English ears. Somebody has the realization that American football is boring. Right.
Well, it's Mango who points that out, and his actual name is Mark Montoya, and he has Latino heritage, and so he's coming at it more from the point of what Americans call soccer.
Yeah.
And he's sitting there in the stands, and he says, this is really boring. If you really look at it, it's start, stop, and it's about 5 seconds of actual playing to 45 seconds of standing around having committee meetings. And so Billy actually starts to watch it, and after a few minutes he thinks, yeah, Mango's right.
Yeah. And of course, having got his football signed, of course, Billy is the first one to just give it away to some. It's another of these great scenes where he bumps into this very, very poor family, gives his ball away, and then it turns out quite a lot of the others give their much cherished balls away because they don't want them. In amongst all of this, God, there's so much going on in this day. Of course, there's this beautiful romance. And of course, he's this 19-year-old kid, so the ideal, for him is a cheerleader. And so that, he makes some sort of he thinks he's making some sort of eye contact with this cheerleader, and then sure enough, it turns out they are, and there's this great connection between them. And I was telling John Freeman, the editor of Granta, about your book, and he said, yeah, well, it's, the thing is, the Dallas Cowboys, they're not just any cheerleaders, they are the ultimate cheerleaders. And then in the name of literary research, he sent me this fantastic clip of the cheerleaders. They really are something. But just tell us a little bit about this all-important romance at the heart of the book, which is entirely believable, by the way.
Thank you. I mean, I felt like I was going out on a limb with that. But Billy is, when we first encounter Billy and he's making his way around the stadium, we find out pretty quickly he's a virgin.
Yeah, why did you think that was? That seemed a little bit, not implausible, but statistically it's not that usual in this day and age, is it?
Well, he's had, a fair number of sexual experiences, but never actual, intercourse. And it bothers him quite a bit. Yeah. And I think partly because he feels like he's behind the curve, statistically. But he's realizing that it's more than sex that he wants. Yeah. Like the night before, the guys were out at a strip club, and in the course of the evening, they all got a blowjob, from one of the strippers. And Billy's thinking, well, it was okay at the time, but I just feel terrible about it today. It's just, it's like a bathtub ring around my psyche, the scum of a bathtub. Yeah. It's just a bad feeling, and he realizes what he wants is the whole connection, the whole body-soul connection. And I mean, he's like the rest of us. He wants to be loved, and he wants to love. And maybe the process or the yearning for him is sped up and intensified because he's a soldier going back to war. But the soldiers they have a press conference, and while they're at the press conference, the cheerleaders are, there around the wall of the room, kind of as decoration, and he starts making eye contact with this cheerleader, and they start playing eye games, and it's all very sweet and innocent, and in a way, the fantasy comes true. Maybe not completely in the way that the ultimate fantasy would be, but they do develop a strong connection. Yeah. And And part of it was, I want to give Billy, I want to show that he has a lot to live for. I mean, if he can make it back, he has a family who needs him and depends on him. He's a smart kid, and he's also capable of loving and being loved.
Yeah, yeah. Great, and I mean, just to sort of emphasize, it works at so many levels. I mean, it's incredibly moving. And throughout, though, it's absolutely hilarious, this book, isn't it? I wonder, when you were writing, were you just sitting there chuckling away?
I was, when the initial conception for certain things would come, I would get a pretty intense burst of pleasure, you know, out of thinking, well, where did that come from? That's actually, you know, I don't know how that popped into my head, but it's wonderful, and I think I'll use it.
And I guess a final question then, it's got this quote from Karl Malnati's as a catch-22 of the Iraq War. Are you happy with it being, do you think, yeah, is it a war book? I mean, the actual amount of time they spend reflecting on the firefight in Iraq is actually minimal. I think you do this really interesting thing of bringing the war home, as it were.
Well, that's what I was interested in exploring. And as you've noted, there's been a lot of great reportage that has come out of this war. And, but what I was interested in was the war at home. And in a way, the business of selling the war. And the way that the soldiers are used as advertisements for the business of war. And what it would feel like to be at the center of that, you know, as a soldier, you know, being aware on the one hand of your experience in that ultimate reality of combat, and then to be back in the United States and to have this, you know, intense consciousness of being presented as a way to sell the war. And so that's what I was interested in exploring.
Great. Okay, Ben, thank you so much.
Thank you, Geoff.
Fantastic
it's been
talking
a pleasure.
to you. Great stuff.